The format is a brief talk, and then we followed by a Q&A. And you can ask questions a couple of ways. You can just put your hand up and we can take a mic to you and you can answer a question live. That'd be fantastic. Or you can write some questions down old school, or you can text them to the number that you see on the front of your outlines there. Now, we're very privileged to have with us Des. Des, do you want to come up here for a moment? It's so nice. So nice to have you. Now, Des told me that he used to work as an associate in the Supreme Court of Tasmania. I used to work as an associate too in the Supreme Court of New South Wales. My chief job, Des, after lunch, was to wake his honour up. Okay, so my judge was sleeping because as you lot droned on, right, in the afternoon heat, and he would be sleeping, and so I had to get his paperclip and say, "Here's Your Honour, here's the paperclip you didn't ask for." Was that your job as well?
No. My judge managed to stay awake most of the time. I found
that wasn't because of you.
No. I used to drive him around. I used to do, I occasionally got him coffees and things like that.
Okay.
And, but no waking him up.
Okay. All right. Now, you had an interesting hobby begun during lockdown. You want to tell us a bit about that?
Well, I did. So I have never had a hobby in my life. And so I finally decided it's time to get one. And so I thought I would try and learn some Spanish using a little app called Duolingo. Some of you might be on Duolingo as well. You'll immediately be seeing a little green owl in your mind's eye. I'm trying to learn Spanish on that one. Yeah.
Good on you. And you're married and you've got how many kids?
Married to Susie. You've got 4 young kids, Dan, Sam, Jemima, and Joel. Oldest is 9.
Good on you. Thank you. Well, Des has asked that a passage from the Bible be read for us this morning. I'm going to ask Jonathan to come up and read that. Is that right?
Totally fine.
And then over to you.
I'll fire away. Great. Thank you.
Reading from 1 Corinthians 15. Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you, as of first importance, what I also received, that Christ died from our sins, in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day, in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, last of all, as to one untimely born, he also appeared to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you very much for having me. And of course, if you're watching from interstate, it's great to be with you virtually this morning as well, as we speak just briefly this morning on the topic of, is Easter believable? Jean Pouchard has been trying to prove for 5 years that she's not dead. In the flesh, she seems very much alive and well, but trying to prove this to the French authorities has been another matter. Pouchard had been involved in an industrial dispute with a former employee, and she had had an award of damages made against her. Now, for a long time, Pouchard hadn't responded to her employer's demands to pay up. And so in November 2017, the aggrieved employee applied to the court to have Pouchard declared dead, and so she could pursue her husband and son for the damages. Well, the court agreed. They declared Pouchard dead, and her identity card, driver's license, bank account, health insurance, and all of her other official documents were invalidated. The only problem was the court hadn't actually asked the employee for any proof that Pouchard was dead, and she was very much alive. And she has since spent the last 5 years trying to prove this fact to the court and have them legally resurrect her, so far without success. Well, of course, Christians believe that Jesus has been trying to prove that he is not dead for 2,000 years. Easter is coming up, and of course, this is what it is all about. The claim that Jesus definitely died, but 3 days later rose to life again. But the question I want us to think just briefly about today is that believable? Can rational, right-thinking people reasonably believe that what is normally impossible, rising to life again, happened in this case? Now, I'm not going to try and convince you of that in 20 minutes. 25 for sure, but 20, no way. Instead, all I'm going to do is just put before you a summary of the reasons that Christians think Jesus did rise from the dead, and then leave you to draw your own conclusions. To do that, I'm going to go to the earliest example of that claim, what we call 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 7. Now, I say what we call because although the letter itself was written in the early AD 50s, the source material it's based on probably goes back to the mid-30s, only a year or two after the purported events it describes. Paul is writing to the church that he started in somewhere between AD 49 and 50, and he's writing to remind them of the gospel, the good news that he first preached to them when he was there. You can see that there in verses 1 to 2, printed in your leaflets. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and in which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you've believed in vain. But that message he preached to them was something that he himself had received earlier. Listen to the words that he uses to describe it in verse 3, which we'll read in just a moment. This is a message which he received and passed on to them. The message he's about to remind them of is not something he formulated himself, in other words, but rather pre-existing content that he just passed on. That certainly makes sense of what we see in verses 3 to 7. All the vocabulary in those verses is very different to what we see Paul use elsewhere. In other words, what we're about to read in verses 3 to 7 are not Paul's words at all, but older words which he gave to the Corinthians when he first started this church, and he's now reminding them of as he writes to them. Now, how much older are these words? How far does this little summary of the Christian message go back? Well, it would seem a very long way indeed, possibly as close as only a year after the events it purports to describe. When you look at examples of sermons in the New Testament book of Acts that we know were delivered only a year or two after Jesus' death, they look very much like they have been based on this summary. And as a result, scholars of all stripes, Christian and otherwise, think that in these verses 3 to 7, we're looking at evidence from extremely close to Jesus' lifetime. Now, of course, that closeness doesn't make the evidence true, but it does radically cut down on the chance of it being either a Chinese whisper, a story changed over time, or of it being the result of either faded or reconstructed memory. We all know that witness statements are much more accurate if they're recorded soon after the events they describe instead of much later. And that's exactly what we have here. Evidence from within perhaps only a year after Jesus' death of what people say they saw happen to him. So, what do these witnesses say they saw happen to Jesus? Well, first of all, these very early witnesses say that he died. Look at verse 3 there in your leaflets. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. Now, leaving aside for the moment the for our sins bit, this is incontrovertible. Everyone agrees that Jesus of Nazareth died, and at about the same time and in the same circumstances. Pontius Pilate is a well-attested to figure from the ancient world, and there is no dispute that in either AD 30 or AD 33, he had the Jewish teacher and purported miracle worker, Jesus of Nazareth, executed by crucifixion. This is attested to by biblical sources, both the New Testament letters and the Gospels, but also extra-biblical sources, the Jewish historian Josephus and the Roman historians Tacitus and Pliny. There is no doubt, in other words, that he died and how. But the second, and of course much more remarkable thing that the witnesses of 1 Corinthians 15 say, is that he also rose again. Look there at verse 4. That he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, according to the scriptures. Now, on what grounds do they make that extraordinary claim? Well, basically, they make it on the grounds that they saw it. Look at verse 5. And that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Cephas is just the Aramaic name for Peter, one of Jesus' first disciples. And the claim here is that Jesus first appeared to him. That is a claim that is corroborated by the eyewitnesses that spoke to Luke when he wrote his biography of Jesus, the Gospel of Luke, and recorded there. Peter saw Jesus alive after he died, and he was the first one to do so. The 12 there in verse 4 is a reference to Jesus' inner circle of disciples, and the claim here is that Jesus appeared to them next. Again, this is a claim that other witnesses also corroborate. Both Matthew and John, who are both part of that 12, say that, and they write it in their biographies. And Mark and Luke, who were not part of the 12, in fact, not even witnesses of Jesus, interviewed those people who were witnesses, and they also say that the 12 were the next people to see him. Then the claim is that Jesus appeared to 500 other people after he died at the same time, some of whom were dead at the time of Paul writing to the Corinthians, but most of whom are still alive. Verse 6 contains that claim. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Now, we don't have any other record of this event, so we can't corroborate this. Maybe it was a wedding or a small rock concert. But the thing that Paul seems to be at pains to stress to the Corinthians is that many of the people there are still alive today at the time of writing, and so can presumably be cross-examined about their evidence. I mean, they can't be cross-examined by us, of course, but that's not their fault. We can't expect them to live for 2,000 years just to be questioned by us. But the point is that if the Corinthians want to check out that claim, they can, because the eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection still exist and can talk to them about it. I remember once doing something very embarrassing at school when I was in high school. I put my hand up in class and accidentally called the teacher mummy. Now, this would have been bad enough, but I was also in grade 8. Now, this meant that not only had I called the teacher mummy, but I'd also let slip that this is obviously what I still obviously called my own mother at home at the age of 13. Now, as you'd understand, I was absolutely mortified. The class burst out laughing and all the boys pointed at me saying, "Des called the teacher mummy." Anyway, I don't know what Mr. Cruikshank made of all of this. But then I did the dumbest thing ever. I just flatly denied it. I mean, the kids were all pointing at me saying, "He called the teacher mummy." And do you know what I said? No, I didn't. I mean, how could I do that? I had just said very clearly in front of 30 witnesses that Mr. Cruikshank was my mother. How then could I say that I hadn't? And then, of course, if after the class this story spread throughout the playground and I tried to deny it there, well, I couldn't do that either. Because even if the kids I was denying it to hadn't been in class with me, they could easily go and find the ones who were and ask them what had happened, and they would have told them. There were just too many witnesses still alive to deny it. Well, of course, that's what Paul is saying about Jesus here. There are too many witnesses still alive who say they saw Jesus rise from the dead to deny it. Once, 500 plus people saw him at once, many of whom are still alive now, and so you can ask them about it. Many people claim they saw Jesus risen from the dead at the same time. Finally, the claim of these very early verses is that Jesus appeared to his brother James, he appeared to all of the apostles, and finally on the road to the Damascus, he appeared to Paul himself. You see that there in verses 7 to 8. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. Well, as we close, let us ask ourselves, why would we believe these accounts? This is the evidence on the table, but how credible is it? It's all very well to say that lots of people saw Jesus after he died, but why should we believe them? Surely there are better explanations. Surely it's much more plausible, isn't it, to believe that either this story was made up or that the disciples were in such a grief-stricken and suggestible state that the rumour somehow spread that Jesus was alive again and they believed him. Well, let's deal with the conspiracy version first, that all of these accounts were deliberately made up. Well, firstly, if these accounts were the product of collusion, we would expect them to be identical or almost identical. I mean, that's what brings conspiracies unstuck. The stories of all the conspirators are just a little too straight. That's not what we find here. All the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' death and resurrection agree on the main points, but differ on the details. They don't disagree, they just have different emphases. That is exactly what you would expect to find from people who saw the same thing, but then went off and wrote down their own versions of it themselves. Agreements on the core facts, but diversity about the peripherals. When I was a judge's associate, I remember once packing up the courtroom one day and listening to the barristers as they did the same with their things. And one of them made exactly this point about his witnesses. He said he'd been really happy with his witnesses because they all agreed on the main points, but differed on the details, which made them seem like they were telling the truth. Hopefully, from his perspective, not just seem like they were telling the truth. And that's exactly how the New Testament documents read, like real accounts. That's the first reason I don't buy the conspiracy theory. Secondly, if this was all made up, why were all of the witnesses willing to die for those accounts later on? We know from history, both biblical and secular, that all of the 12 disciples mentioned here died for their faith. They persisted in claiming that they'd seen Jesus rise from the dead. Why would they do that if they knew that was a lie? Charles Colson was one of Richard Nixon's inner circle who was involved in the Watergate scandal and went to prison for it. But he later became a Christian. And he later said this about the resurrection. I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified that they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. That's the second reason I don't buy the collusion version. The third is that it would just be so easy to disprove at the time. We know that the rumour that Jesus had risen from the dead spread very quickly through Jerusalem within a matter of days after his death. What could have been easier from a Roman perspective than simply producing the body? I mean, they had it in the tomb under armed guard after all. Why not just produce it? Well, clearly because they didn't have it. But why didn't they have it? I mean, the Romans wouldn't have moved it. It was under armed guard. They wanted to keep the body exactly where it was. And the disciples couldn't have stolen it. It was under armed guard. Which leaves the extraordinary option that Jesus' body removed itself under its own steam, which is extraordinary. But to borrow from Sherlock Holmes, if you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Well, much more briefly, what if this wasn't the product of collusion, but rather just an honest mistake? That a rumour somehow spread that Jesus was raised from the dead and his grief-stricken and suggestible disciples believed it. Well, of course, we all know that it is true that people have a tendency to believe what they want to believe, all of us included. There's a great episode in The Simpsons where Marge says to Homer, Homer, you only hear what you want to hear. To which Homer says, thanks, Marge, I'd love another beer. And of course, this is possible that this is what happened with the disciples. The rumour somehow emerged and the disciples latched onto it. This would explain the differences in the account. There's no coordinated effort to collude. And it would also explain to some extent the disciples' willingness to die. They really did believe these claims. But it still doesn't fully explain things. You may be willing to believe thin evidence when life is going well, but when you have a sword to your throat, surely that concentrates the mind, makes you wonder whether you really did see Jesus or someone else. And yet the disciples were remarkably adamant right up until the end. It makes you think they weren't just susceptible. Further, the Romans producing Jesus' body would have been just as effective at shutting down a deluded claim as a colluded one. And yet they didn't. Why not? Now, does all of this prove that Jesus rose from the dead? Of course it doesn't. Not absolutely. No historical claim can be made absolutely or proven in that way. Does it prove it beyond reasonable doubt? Well, reasonable people may disagree on this one. The evidence certainly leaves room for doubts, but whether they're reasonable or not is itself debatable. But on the balance of probability, well, I would want to say just yes. On the balance of probability, the evidence makes the case. That's certainly the conclusion Justice Peter Young, a now retired New South Wales Supreme Court appeal judge, reached when he made his assessment of the evidence for the resurrection. And it's the same conclusion that other lawyers have also drawn when assessing this evidence. So is Easter believable? Yes, I think it is. Is it true? Well, I think it is. But I understand if you're not yet convinced. After all, we've only had 20 minutes, not 25. But what I want to leave all of us with is this. If this is not true, then of course there is nothing more to worry about. This has just been an interesting breakfast with a nice chance to catch up with people and have a croissant. But if this is true, then surely this must turn the world on its head. And it's something that you will need to follow up. Why not talk to the friend who brought you and see what they think? Well, thank you for your time. I think we now have some time for questions. Thank you, Peter.
Oh, thanks very much, Des. That story when you were in year 8 made my ears burn.
Mine too.
That was, I feel a bit, I broke out in a cold sweat when you told that story. That was fantastic. Thank you. Now, we've already got a question coming in on the text.
Great.
Just please take a moment now to just jot down a question on that spare bit of paper, or if you'd like to text another question through, or you can use the chat function if you're online. So the questions are coming in. This is my favourite part of City Legal.
Mine too.
So here we go. First question, all truth is subjective. Do you agree?
I think that all truth is apprehended by subjective people. That is me. So absolutely, I'm like Homer Simpson. I will have a tendency to believe the things I want to believe. And so, yes, I need to take into account all sorts of things when weighing evidence. Bias, the possibility of collusion, the possibility of other people's mistakes, absolutely. We're not dealing with maths here where you can have absolute proof. But that doesn't mean that because I'm subjective, the facts that I'm investigating are things either did or didn't happen. Jesus' body either is or isn't in its tomb. And so I think, yes, I need to be rightly cautious about the things going on inside my own mind. But once I've done that, I can actually, with a very great degree of confidence, assess facts out there in the world. So I'm subjective, but I don't think truth is subjective. I think truth claims can be absolutely made. And of course, we make them all the time. So that's what I'd say to that.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I've got a question here on the text. Damien, you want to just wander around and pick up any of the other questions that are coming through? So this is a question here, not about when you're in year 8.
Good, good.
You worked as an associate and a lawyer and are now an Anglican minister. Well, we didn't talk about that, did we?
No.
What led to this change of career?
Yeah, sure. It wasn't because I hated the law. I enjoyed my job and I thought it was a really worthwhile job. I think being a lawyer, despite all of the bad rap that we get, is a really worthy profession.
That's nice, isn't it? These people can go home today feeling like confident.
Yeah, that's right.
You're for them, aren't you?
Very much, very much.
We should do this again.
It really just came down to, I think, what all of us do is we think, how can I best make use of the life I've been given and the gifts that I've been given? And it really just came down to, I thought, on balance, I thought I'd make a better minister than I would lawyer. Okay. That's basically it.
Okay, right. Thank you very much. We've got another question here that's come through. Actually, if someone wants to ask a question live, that's what our speaker really prefers. So is there any, do you want to wander around with this mic, Damien? And then I think there's a brave soul out there who wants to ask a question. If just put your hand up and Damien can come to you. There's another question here that I want to ask you. What do you say to the proposition that all of this happened so long ago that it is just not believable, just the actual expanse of time, 2,000 years?
Yeah, sure. Now, of course, the passage of time does make it harder to get hold of facts because people forget things get washed away by time and all of the effects of time. So, of course, that's true. But that's why I think it's so fascinating. You want to get witness accounts that go very early into things. So you're right, I'm living 2,000 years after these events, but I do have access to witness statements that I have very good reasons to think were actually written down and recorded, possibly within even 12 to 24 months of the events, and that they haven't changed. And so I can actually get access to that. And of course, in reality, we actually believe lots of things about the past on much poorer evidence than this. So the facts about, say, Julius Caesar are well attested to by ancient documents, and I have no reason to doubt them. I actually have much better attested documents about the life of Jesus of Nazareth. So if I can believe it about Caesar, why not about Jesus?
All right. Some people say that, they've got a question here. Thanks. Thank you.
Sort of a comment more than a question. Your comment about maths
Yes.
being provable. Maths is based on assumptions.
Yes.
And every time you add one, the same thing occurs throughout all the numbers. It's also based on the belief in things that don't exist, like the square root of -1. Our whole life is based on the square root of -1 because all electricity and all the calculations around that are on things that don't exist. There are also things that are unprovable that we base our lives on that are in maths. So, you know, the concept that things are provable is even then not, even in something as simple as mathematics, is not real.
And there you go. I'm out of my pay grade at that point.
He's a wise man. We've got another question from the floor. Thank you very much, sir.
Just an observation and then a question.
Yes.
One of the biggest proofs, of course, that the Lord did rise was that anyone who believed in it benefited nothing. Women and children were persecuted and brutally killed. So it wasn't that it was just the men who were trying to perpetuate this myth. You know, there was quite a terrible persecution that broke out. So that's just an observation. The question is this: given the preponderance of evidence that the Lord did live and was resurrected, why do so many people choose to disbelieve?
Sure. And I think that's a great question. But I think there's all sorts of reasons for that. So I think, obviously I'm a Christian, and so I believe this, but I don't want to overstate the evidence. So I do think that reasonable people can still have debates about this. I mean, I'm personally convinced, and I think the evidence is overwhelmingly in favour, but people will still have debates about it. My hunch, though, is that deep down, the reason many people might not believe this when confronted with the evidence is actually more that subjective element. That is, again, I'm like Homer, I want to hear what I want to hear. And if I'm going about my life as an autonomous self, living my own life, to discover that there might be someone else out there who lays a more absolute claim to me than me, I'm not going to want that. And so I might not believe simply because I don't want to believe or it's inconvenient. And there are lots of stories of people who became Christians. C.S. Lewis is a wonderful example of that. They become Christians, but very reluctantly, by their own admission, because of exactly that. I think there's a question over here as well, but I'm not sure how much time we have.
Yeah, no, we've got enough time. That's great. Thank you very much, Dave. Question from Dave.
G'day. I was just wondering.
That's right. Yeah, that's fine, mate. Good
from an empirical perspective, like a scientific view, like evidence has to be testable, falsifiable, verifiable. So obviously you're never going to prove that Jesus Christ rose because from a scientific perspective, you can't do it. So isn't it more a matter of faith? And why do you have to prove it?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. And if I've heard you right, the question is,
you can't empirically prove it.
Yeah, that's right. So it's like, yeah, that's right. I think though, you're right. We can't scientifically prove it, but that's not because it's something that can't be proved. It's just because it's not susceptible to the scientific method. So science and history are both equally valid ways of getting at truth. They're just different sorts of truth. Science is very good at telling me about molecules that I can put in a test tube now and examine, but we just don't use that method to investigate history. We rather look at documents and material evidence, archaeology and things like that. And that's how we get at that kind of truth. But you can still get at it. That doesn't mean that it's either scientific or faith. I think you can actually still very much have great intellectual confidence in historical facts. You just don't get at them through science because it's just the wrong tool in the toolkit.
Science can't prove that I was speeding last week.
No,
But
although you're in a room full of lawyers, so be careful of confessions.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions from the floor? Yes, question here, thanks. Do you want to just pass the microphone, Damien, to our friend Jonathan?
This message of Easter's believable. How do you say then that this would impact a daily life of a lawyer? Lawyer working through the grind of billable hours and targets and all of that.
Yeah, sure.
But Easter's believable. Is there a way to link those two concepts?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly when I was a lawyer, and I don't think I ever hit a billing target in my life, but when I was a lawyer, I think the very real difference this made was, does it particularly make a difference to how I interpret the laws of evidence? No. At the end of a hard day, though, does it mean that I've still got hope in life? Absolutely, it does. Does it put my life in perspective? Absolutely, it does. The thing I found about the law, even when I was in it for a very brief period of time, is how much, if you let it, it can just swallow up your life, your identity, your feeling of value. I'm not a success unless I do really well at this. Things can take on a size that they don't actually really deserve. Knowing that someone rose from the dead and that actually, if this is true, I might have an eternal life as well. That was just a huge comfort to me. Going, in the end, I want to do a good job, but there's much more to life than this. In fact, there's much more to the universe.
Okay, we've got just time for one more question from Peter here. Yeah. Yes, that's okay. Yeah, where you go.
I'm not a lawyer, but I'm interested in
You're welcome, Peter. You're welcome.
It's semi-serious.
Yeah.
Do lawyers believe in truth?
It's a great question.
Well, I'd have to ask current lawyers, and I'm not sure what the High Court has said on that. Yeah, I think lawyers believe in truth. I mean, I can't speak for however many tens of thousands of lawyers there are in Australia, but I think that lawyers believe in truth. I don't think we're all as cynical as some may make out. We know that truth can sometimes be hard to get to and that a courtroom might not always be the best place to prove it, but I certainly do.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, please join me in thanking Des for speaking so warmly this morning.
Thank you.
We've just got a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to draw your attention to something on the back of your outlines. You can see there's a QR code there, so if you wouldn't mind just getting your phones out and scanning that, and that's a chance for you to give us some feedback on today, give Des some feedback, and also it's the only way to find out about future City Legal events. When we're talking about future events, we're very excited to say that we're hoping to be back here the 8th of September. To do another in-person City Legal. But something that Damien's going to organise is actually every now and then, every 6 weeks or so, he's going to have a breakfast and you're going to zoom into a City Legal from somewhere else in the country. So City Legal's operating in Perth, in Brisbane, in Sydney, Parramatta, all over the place. And he's picked a date. I think it's, let me just have a look. It's the 12th of May is the next one. So just watch out for... Well, yes, no, that's the one that Damien's going to organise a little party for. Yeah, will be then. So, that's another way you can participate. And you just on the back of your outlines, you'll also see something extremely exciting. That is the inaugural City Legal National Conference in Canberra at Regis Hotel, Canberra. We've got some great speakers: David Robertson, Dan Anderson from the Lachlan Macquarie Institute, John Bales, and CLE seminars. you to get your CPD points up, CLE points. We're going to have some seminars with John Steenhoff. That's the 22nd and 23rd of September, starting on the Thursday evening, 22nd, about 6. And we'll have a city legal the next morning. So look, if you happen to be in Canberra, we'd love to have you. It'd be fantastic. Now, Damien, have I forgotten anything else? I think we're right. Okay, good. Look, thank you so much again for being a part of City Legal. And there's plenty of food, so please hang around. But if you need to get off to work, we understand. So thanks so much. See you.